Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Pernille Rieker. I'm a research professor here at NUPI and also head of our Center for European Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this early Monday morning seminar on how to ensure democratic resilience in Europe. I'm also very pleased to see that so many of you have made your way here this morning, and I also would like to welcome those of you who follow this online, because this seminar will be streamed. And this seminar is part of a project that we have together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs called Norway and the EU Towards 2030. And in this project we are covering 4 different areas in Norway's relations with the EU: security and defense, Green Deal, health union, as well as democracy, rule of law, and democratic resilience, which is the topic of this seminar today. And NUPI and myself is also coordinating another relevant project funded by the European Commission. It's the Horizon Europe project on enlargement and democratic resilience, which is called Re-engage. And this topic is, of course, very important and unfortunately also increasingly urgent. For 75 years this year, the Council of Europe has been continent's garden of democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And the EU has also played a key role here since its foundation, through its treaties, as well as through its enlargement policies and neighborhood policy, which are the key instruments to promote democracy in the Union and abroad. But in a geopolitical, more challenging context, where misinformation flourishes, more collective action is needed. And President Ursula von der Leyen has therefore called for the creation of a European democracy shield, a notion that captures in many ways this urgent need for collective action. But the question is, what does it really mean in practice? How can the EU and the Council of Europe and the individual European democracies work better together to improve democratic resilience in Europe? Do we need to be tougher with the states that are not respecting the basic rules of democracy, both inside the European Union and outside? Or do we need a different and more targeted approach altogether? And if so, what should this approach look like? These are some of the questions that I hope we will touch upon in today's discussion. And we are also very fortunate to have a very distinguished panel, a competent panel, who will share their insights and on how we can navigate these challenges and safeguard our democratic institutions. State Secretary of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Maria Wæther, Minister of State for Europe and German at the Minister of State for Europe at the German Federal Foreign Office, Dr. Anna Lührmann, who has previously also worked on these issues in academia. She has been the Deputy Director for VIDEM and has published widely on the topic of democratic resilience, and we actually often refer to your work in our project, so that's very interesting to have you here. Then we have Deputy Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Bjørn Berge. And last but not least, Professor Christophe Hillon from NUPI and University of Oslo. Part of that we have on the EU, Norway and the EU towards 2030. So I very much look forward to a rich and thought-provoking discussion. Each of you will have up to 10 minutes, and it would be good if you manage to limit yourself so we can have some room for discussion. But with no further ado, I will give the floor first to the Norwegian State Secretary, Maria Wæther, and then we will follow in the order that I present you. And then later we will have a discussion and you will sit here. But we can start here in...
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pernille. Good morning to you all. Dear Minister of State, dear Deputy Secretary General, dear Professor, ladies, gentlemen, it's truly wonderful to start the day in this way together with you. And allow me to start by thanking NUPI for arranging this seminar on an issue of utmost importance to my government. And I truly, honestly, could not think of a better way of starting the day than by participating at this event together with my German colleague Anna Lurman, on the important topic on how to ensure democratic resilience in Europe today. And I'm pleased to see that despite us starting quite early, that the turnout is so good, and I'm also very happy that several people are also following on stream. Dear all, what we will focus on for the next good hour, I often think of as truly existential. Europe is standing at a crossroads in time, and the multilateral architecture taking shape in the aftermath of the Second World War and the post-Cold War era, well, it's being put to a historic test. The outbreak of a full-scale war on our continent, rise of authoritarian forces, polarization and increasing rivalry between great powers are challenging the very core of Europe, the fundamental values of democracy, human rights, and rule of law. Now, the outcome of the war in Ukraine will define the future and security of Europe. And this makes it imperative to stand with Ukraine and make sure it prevails in its fight for freedom and for democracy. Now, more than ever, and more than in decades at least, security is the cross-cutting dimension of all European policies and politics. So strengthening of European competitiveness, it has become a key in this regard, not least because the world is in the middle of a deep technological, economic, and energy policy restructuring, which will also influence the shaping of completely new security policy landscape. A commitment to military defense and civil preparedness alone, however, will not provide the security we need. So thus we need to think of security in a broader sense. Increase in defense spending and stepping up military industry production must, therefore, be accompanied by strengthening of democratic institutions such as politically independent judiciary, such as a free press and a vibrant civil society. And all of this is well reflected in the strategic agenda for the next 5-year period of the new Commission headed by Ursula von der Leyen. And I have to say, Norway fully supports the priority of the strategic agenda for a free and democratic Europe, a strong and secure Europe, and a prosperous and competitive Europe. In an era of rapidly intensifying geopolitical rivalry, Europe needs to stand up for common interests and common values. The war in Ukraine has fundamentally shifted our view on the challenges we face in Europe. After decades of peace on our continent, Europe has realized that it must do a lot more to ensure its own security. However, this very task of increasing European security in a broad sense is perhaps the most challenging of all. Because threats to a sustainable and vibrant democracy in Europe no longer mainly come from external sources and stressors. They also come from within. We see evidence of dwindling trust in political leadership, systems, and institutions. In too many countries, people are expressing a decline in and experiencing a decline in freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. The very fundamentals enabling conditions for democracy. And in too many countries, we see how democratically elected leaders take advantage of people's trust in the electoral system and misuse this trust to stay in power. The very foundation that Europe is built on is being put to a historical test. At times it seems like we're living in an era of discontent. Democracy is being questioned. Hate speech is spreading both on and offline and targeting LGBTQI plus communities and other vulnerable groups. Progress in gender and diversity is replaced by cultural backlash and discrimination. This is being fueled by populism and often amplified by disinformation. We also know that Russia and others are engaging in a hybrid warfare against our democracies. And we cannot be naive in this regard. But our actions to counter hybrid warfare must work within our democratic context and not undermine the freedom of speech. Elections is a fundamental part of democracy, and 2024 is the election super cycle year. It will set a record for the most voters in human history casting their ballot. Friends, against a dark geopolitical backdrop, we see a number of worrying megatrends. An increase in number of conflicts is one, and the focus of the seminar on democracy backsliding and under pressure is another. A few weeks ago, International IDEA revealed a report on the global state of democracy. Now, during the last 5 years in Europe, that is from 2018 to 2023, more countries are declining than advancing in critical factors such as credible elections, access to justice, and civil liberties. And the way people are engaging with electoral process has also been changing over the past several decades. Turnout has been going down, and the incidents of protests and riots are going up. These trends are deeply worrying. Europe and the institutions we established in the aftermath of the Second World War were built on the promise of never again. It is built on the belief that the best system for our people is democracy, built on respect for human rights and for rule of law, and that real democracies do not start wars against their neighbors. So we see the protection, and we need the protection of European democracies, not just as a fight for what is the best system for our societies. It is also a security issue for us. And the Russian leadership, on the other hand, sees European democracy as the biggest threat to their totalitarian regime. They are afraid that our values and our ideas will find resonance in their people, and that the democratic opposition could grow and topple them. In countering attacks on democratic values and authoritarian measures, it is important for democracies to join efforts. Norway wants to strengthen our dialogue with Europe, the EU, and the member states on how we can protect, promote, and strengthen democracy together. Dear all, I have already mentioned 2 megatrends, and yet another is the very fact that we are living in an era of de-globalization, an era of regionalization where regions matter more. This includes how we stand up for core values of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. The very values that Vladimir Putin is at war with, and the very values that thousands of Ukrainians are fighting for and giving their lives for, to be a part of. As you know, Norway is not a member of the EU, but we are fully integrated into the single market. This connects us to the EU and makes EU and Europe our home. And Europe is our continent, so geography obviously also plays a role here. And most importantly, Europe is our value club. So, friends, it's then no surprise, of course, that Norway wants and needs the EU and Europe to succeed. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Norway signed a new agreement with the EU on a new period of the EEA and the Norway grants. It is the largest contribution the EU to EU cohesion from the EEA and EFTA states until now. The agreement will make available around 3.2 billion euros to 15 EU states over the next years. And the EU and Norway, together with Iceland and Liechtenstein, have committed to make our common values a basis for all funding. As we negotiate national agreements with the 15 countries covered by the grants, this will be a very core issue. We will launch a series of initiatives over the next years to promote democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And this autumn, we will launch a new fund to support civil society in the 15 EU member states covered by the funds. More than 300 million euros will be dedicated to a fund to to be distributed at country level. In addition, we will secure funding to support initiatives at the European level to promote networking between key stakeholders for the fundamental values. And we will strengthen our cooperation with the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, the OECD, and of course, and not least, with the Council of Europe. We must stand up for democracy and the rule of law within our borders. At the 2023 summit in Reykjavik, we adopted the Reykjavik Principles for Democracy. Our common agenda must be focused on implementation to effectively counter democratic backsliding and ensure non-discrimination of vulnerable groups, and along with our commitment to the Istanbul Convention for the rights of women and girls. And allow me to say as clearly as I can, it is simply not acceptable that there are political prisoners in Europe in the 21st century. Now, Norway and Germany share a commitment to protect our common values, and I hope we will work even closer on these issues in the time to come. Anna, I'm so happy you're here, and I'm so happy that we will continue conversation on all of these important topics later on today. And I'm looking forward to the panel. I think that was well within the 10 minutes. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maria. And then I give the floor to you, Anna Lydman.
Yeah, hey, I'm very happy to be here today. By now it's like 7 years ago or so, I was sitting a few kilometers from here in Gothenburg at the university, at the Videm Institute, and wrote an article called The Third Wave of Autocratization. Scholars among you have probably seen it. Sort of really laying an analytical framework for the phenomenon that we're discussing today, that more and more countries across the world face a problem that actually their democracy doesn't die overnight, but that actors get to power in democratic election and then slowly start eroding democracy from within. We often forget that this was a phenomenon that actually started in Russia also in the 90s. That we've seen in Turkey, that we're seeing in Hungary. We know that also within the EU, there are many more actors, illiberal parties, contesting in elections that have actually similar objectives, or at least the risk of doing this. And therefore, so while I was sitting in Gothenburg working on these topics, of course, as a Democrat, my biggest question was then, okay, how can we stop this actually, this third wave? How can we move from this analysis to actually a state of democratic resilience? So of a state where we as democracies are challenged by these kind of actors, but we can bounce back and we can gain resilience. And then I wrote another article actually with a very positive note saying that Europe has been, despite a lot of challenges to democracy, has been quite resilient, at least until then, and maybe until now still. And despite also many setbacks in my own country with the rise of the far right now in the elections in Eastern Germany, I'm still very optimistic and very positive that yes, we live in times where we're tested, also by malign foreign actors such as Russia, that uses active policies of disinformation, of hybrid warfare on our countries, but still our societies remain very resilient, and still the majority of our citizens votes for Democratic Party and stands up for democracy day to day, also on the streets. We've seen in Germany, for instance, mass demonstrations at the beginning of this year, and it's very clear that the vast majority of Germans doesn't want to go in this direction. The question is, who of the two actors mobilizes better? I think that's a key question. But for us now as governments, I think the question is, what can we do as governments also to strengthen this democratic resilience? It's a big job for civil society, for citizens to go out and be active, but I think for us as governments as well. And therefore I want to share 3 thoughts with you, one on disinformation, one on how the EU can protect its values, and then also some tasks for the democracy shield that is coming. By the way, if anyone can tell me why it's called democracy shield and not democratic shield, let me know. Anyway, because I saw you were stumbling over it as well. It's but it's democracy shield. That's von der Leyen's creation. So let's start with disinformation. So a question to you here in Oslo. How many of you know that in Paris there's a problem with bed bugs? Have you heard about this? Yeah. And who of you knows that the problem is actually not that serious, but that it was amplified by Russian disinformation? Yeah, okay, you're more or less experts. So I spoke with my daughter recently. She's 16, and my mother had warned us of going to Paris because of the bedbug problem. So I told her, look, actually we can go to Paris, it's okay, because now the French government has found out that it was the Russians amplifying this news and that actually it wasn't that serious. And you know what my daughter said, my own daughter? She was like, how do you know? And then I showed her, I Googled, American technology, I Googled, and I showed her an article on Tagesschau.de, which is like the most credible news source that we have, public broadcaster, their online portal. And it had an article from that quoted my French counterpart, actually, Jean-Noël Barrot at that time, saying that yes, the French security authorities have found evidence that it was the Russians amplifying on social media this information. So, and she looked at the article and was like, well, the French government has an interest in letting us think that it was the Russians. My own daughter. So this really, for me, was an eye-opening moment to actually see that sort of what we always are talking about, that we should educate citizens to better discover fake news, disinformation, deep fakes, all that stuff. That's only one part of the story. The more important part is actually to gain trust in some information as well, which is the much harder story. Because in the end, that's actually what these autocrats are aiming at, and what those actually doing this disinformation, what they're aiming at. They aim at sowing distrust in our societies. They aim at making us hate each other, at going to, at not trusting each other, because societies and democracies in the end are built on trust. I mean, the scholars among you know the bowling alone thing from Putnam and all that. So it's really like this is the very foundation of how democracies work, that there's some sort of trust in some common narrative and in some source of facts. So what is happening now with all this disinformation around is really that it's undermining this. And therefore I think we really need to think about how we can contribute to societies and to an understanding of these are news sources that can actually be trusted. And there's some interesting initiatives around there. Reporters Without Borders, for instance, has an idea of actually having an ISO norm on credible journalism. We are proposing together with France and Poland, actually some other EU member states, to have an EU media platform that where citizens can access credible and fact-checked news. So I think that's really a debate that needs to be much more in the center stage, without falling in the trap of creating some sort of ministry of truth, of course, right? That's not, I mean, it's not sort of, this is not, it shouldn't be the job of governments to say this is true or not true, but still there needs to be a facilitation of an infrastructure that enables this kind of debate. Then the second thing that we need to do in the realm of disinformation is, of course, to first of all discover it more. So we are investing now a lot as German government actually in figuring out, for instance, on X, doppelganger networks or these kind of things. So we have uncovered recently a big Russian-sponsored network of fake accounts that spreaded lies about the war in Ukraine. We have informed the public also about this, that this is out there. And we need to all share information about this in the EU, but also with our close allies such as Norway, so that we can actually act together against this, because often these kind of campaigns target us all. And then we need also, as democratic governments, be better in our strategic communication about things, right? So that we sort of pre-bunk, that's the technical term, these kind of news. And then thirdly, what we need to do is, of course, also make sure that online we have similar rules as offline when it comes to the multiplication of information. And for that, the Digital Services Act, I think, is a very good tool that really needs to be used. So I'm also very curious to learn a bit more about the Norwegian experiences with this implementation, because we really need to make sure that, yes, there's freedom of speech online, but not freedom of reach when it comes to disinformation, to hate, to also illegal content. Then, so that's on the disinformation side. Then I promised to say something about how the EU can better protect its values inside. I mean, here, finally, we are using some instruments that we have as EU, such as the Article 7 proceedings, where we have regular hearings of governments that violate our norms. We have been freezing money, namely for Hungary and Poland, in order to make clear that we cannot accept European taxpayers' money to go into the coffers of government, where we cannot ensure that these are not spent in a corrupt way, that the rule of law is being applied, and all of this. So I think that at least shows some effects also on these governments, but I think we need to go much further. We need to also reform these kind of instruments and make sure that we really have sharp instruments that can are really a deterrent also for any governments that might think in that direction, that they want to erode the rule of law or limit freedom of media. I think this is really something that we cannot tolerate within the EU. Yeah, and finally, all of this is being addressed in the democracy shield of the new EU Commission. President von der Leyen has clearly put that at the center of her agenda. Here, really, some of the things that I've just mentioned, also with fighting disinformation, are in there. Also, some of the protection of the rule of law internally. A lot of, I spoke with some of the responsible people in the Commission, and they are really looking for instruments still. So it's very much, particularly for scholars, now an interesting time also to discuss, also to maybe learn from countries like Norway what you're doing here, so that we can implement it in the EU. And I think the good news is, and with this I want to end, that really in many countries we find extremely good civil society projects, for instance, games that where students or also people of older age groups can really learn how to differentiate deep fakes from real information, how to be critical with information, how to maybe also trust some information. So there's so many initiatives out there tested by pedagogues in classrooms around the world, and now we just need to scale it up. So I think that's the moment we're in, where we have done so many pilots everywhere. Now, and this is really where the EU comes in with the democracy shield, we need to scale up the things that work to really ensure that we strengthen our democratic resilience. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nirman. Then I give the floor to Bjørn Berge.
Thank you very much, and a very good morning to all of you. And thank you also to Anna and Maria for very interesting presentations. And you're absolutely right, Anna, that many are standing up for democracy today. But we need that, actually, right now. And there are so many threats, both internally and externally, to democracy today. And I'd like to go through some of them. It hasn't been mentioned yet, so I think it complements quite nicely what you already had said. First of all, in Europe today, we see that civil society is struggling in many European countries. In many ways, the room of maneuver for civil society is being curtailed. We have read in the news about the new types of legislation that is introduced, referring to foreign agents, also referring to foreign influence. Secondly, we see many challenges to media and freedom of expression. We see that journalists are harassed, they are arrested, they're even killed in Europe today. We see slaps, these legal proceedings against journalists. We see the ownership of media is often on a very few hands. It could be oligarchs who buys them up, or other groups that have close connections to the sitting government. We see disinformation, as Anna has pointed to already. This is really polluting our minds. This is an enormous challenge for Europe, and not only Europe, far beyond Europe today. And what is most important here is that it is also influencing our elections. And this is really the centerpiece of any democracy. We need to have free and fair elections. We also see fake news, an increase in hate speech, lies. We also see in Europe today the rise of anti-rights movements who wants to fight that we have tried to bring equal rights to minorities, to LGBTI groups and people. We see courts that are becoming less and less independent, a fundamental aspect of the rule of law. We see violence against women on the rise in Europe today and globally. We see the more sickening cases of femicide, gender-based violence and rape, both in peacetime and also in war. And we see also a lack of economic opportunities, increasing inequalities. And we all know about the devastating inflation we have had and the economic difficulties in many European countries. And the cost of living is increasing. We see the rise of populism, both on the extreme left side of the political scale and also on the right side. We see a loss of trust in our governments and the political institutions among some. They don't trust that they can really cope with the situation and the challenges we are facing today. And we see young people, youth, losing hope. There was a survey in the Netherlands asking those born after year 2000, how important is it for you to live in a democracy? 1 out of 3 said it was important. 1 out of 3 of young people. I don't think this is unique for the Netherlands. Maybe we have similar surveys in other countries. And I don't think they want a Putin-style government or a Chinese model. I think they just don't know. There is a lack of understanding and awareness of what it really means. We also see the lack of efficient and speedy implementation of the judgments of the most prominent court in Europe, the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, which is essential, actually. And I also played such a crucial role over the last decades. I will come back to that. Last but not least, and it's already mentioned, we see the appalling invasion of the Russian Federation of Ukraine, which is such a fundamental breach of the fundamental principle, the UN Charter, all our values. And this is really unacceptable. And it's an old ghost that is revisiting Europe today. And this is violent, aggressive nationalism, combined with these utopian dreams of rebuilding an empire. That's why it's so dangerous. Of course, we are also working now, and this is quite an essential point, on establishing a special tribunal on the crime of aggression. Because this is the worst of all crimes. This is the decision taken by political leaders to start an invasion and attack another country. It's a missing hole in international law today. I know the International Criminal Court have a reference to it in the Kampala protocol, but it's not enough. So we need a special tribunal, and that in itself in itself will send a very important signal to Europe and the rest of the world that this is unacceptable. And work is ongoing on this. And that is very, very important. And I agree also with the UN Secretary General, who said, was it last week at a high-level session in New York, that we live in a world of impunity. And where violations and abuses threaten the very foundation of international law and the UN Charter. And it's not only in Europe, it's elsewhere, globally. So the big question then is, what do we do? What do we do when we face this very crucial and important challenge? I think, first of all, we continue to do everything we can to support Ukraine. This is essential. In that, we also try to stop aggressive nationalism and also the anti-democratic forces that continuously seek to undergrade our political institution and our democracy. So I think Ukraine in itself has been a big wake-up call for all of us. And what we have understood and what we have learned is that we need to fight for our rights today. We take so much for granted. But we need to fight for these rights today, unfortunately. And that brings me to my second point, what to do. I think we should focus on our first line of defense. And what is our first line of defense? That is the unique system we have built up in Europe today over 7 decades, with the European Convention of Human Rights, with several other conventions, with the court that all member states, all governments are obliged to execute their judgments of. And this is unique. You don't find it anywhere else in the world. And the judgment of the court, as a matter of fact, has also led to a very important harmonization of legislation throughout all European countries. So it doesn't matter if you are living in Spain or in Norway or on Iceland, you have the same rights. And this is a fantastic system. And it's a dynamic system. Because as developments come, as new challenges come, it's been able also to introduce new standards, new ways of dealing with them. And I will just mention 3 to you today. And that is what we have done to combat violence against women with the Istanbul Convention. It's today recognized as so crucial and so important for governments today to address this issue. Secondly, cybercrime is also a huge challenge. And there is a cybercrime convention. There's an office in Bucharest who has programs and projects not only in Europe but throughout the world. It's really important and doing a very impressive work right now. And it's also securing equal rights for minorities. And in particular, I want to mention the LGBTI people, where we have a CM recommendation from 2010 that is still seen as the gold standards and all the civil society is pointing to. This is really helping us. This is what we need. And secondly, it's not enough to adopt new legislation or a new convention or a new treaty. Actually, you need to see to it that the governments are actually implementing what they have signed. And that's why monitoring is so important. And for your information, there is a sophisticated system today where experts are traveling to all European countries and are inspecting and analyzing to what degree the governments are actually following up on the legal text they have committed themselves to. So this is also essential. Of course, sometimes it's a pain in the butt for the government because they criticize them. It's not something that everybody appreciates. But this is so essential. It's not enough only to adopt the legislation. You need also to make sure it's implemented. But that in itself is not even enough. You also need to help these governments to implement this legislation. And that's why this expertise that is provided, the various programs and projects is so essential. And that brings me really to the third point. What we need in Europe today, if we all agree that this is a massive challenge, we need a comprehensive European action plan where the Council of Europe, the EU, other international organizations, but also civil society and other groups, we come together and they define certain priorities. This is what we will focus now. And then we also start, and this is, by the way, a proposal right now from the new Secretary General in the Council of Europe, Alain Berset. He's a former Swiss president. He just introduced this also some weeks ago. So this is really fundamental. And I think this can really help us because we need concrete action. And we need also to engage in a systematic dialogue with all countries in Europe, as a matter of fact, because we all have, to various degrees, these challenges today. And raise awareness, engage the government at the highest level, and work together. And this should be a critical dialogue. Huh? We should speak the truth. And I think this is also very important. And we need to mobilize. There are so many partners, friends, networks who really fight, as you said, Anna, for democracy today. We need to engage with them, bring them on board in this joint venture. So, and then you can ask, what should we focus on? It's been mentioned already by Maria. Last year, all the European leaders, they adopted 10 principles of democracy. They are very interesting, very fundamental if you look at them. That's where we have, okay, we focus on that. It's not enough just to adopt this in paper again. You need to see it implemented. And that's why it's very important to focus also on that. So maybe with that I will end. Of course, I can already mention that we have such a close cooperation with the EU in so many aspects of the work. We have regular meetings with them. I represent the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. And they are also, as a matter of fact, now financing a lot of what we do in the field, because we have offices, we have field offices, we have action plans, and altogether is 164 million euros we are talking about here, which is what, 2 milliarder norske kroner, 2 milliarder norske kroner. So it's not it's a lot of money. And also I want to mention here the excellent cooperation we have with Norway EEA grants. Because why is that important? Because then we can also work in 15 EU countries, not only non-members of the EU. Okay, so maybe I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think that was what you end on that. I guess this is something that you will follow up on, Christoph. So then I give the floor to you.
No? Is it working now? Very good. Thanks, Pernille. What a privilege indeed to start the week in such great company. Thank you for having me. Indeed, I will build on some of the things that have already been said. I want to focus on the EU, being a narrow EU lawyer myself. I'd like to start by saying a few things about the key role that the EU can play in preserving democracy and the rule of law. It has a mandate, a strong mandate indeed, legally, to play that role. And then I will turn to a too timid use of the tools it has at its disposal to preserve democracy and the rule of law. And that timidity is really at our own peril. I think it's high time we should push the EU and its member state to use those tools effectively so as to protect our common legal order. I'm French, so I'm an EU citizen, and I look at these institutions are my institutions. The key role of the EU first. Well, it has to do with two things. There are two elements to the mandate of the EU. The first one is that the rule of law, democracy are regarded as what is called in EU jargon founding values of the EU, which are common to the member states. And that means that in order for a third state to become a member state of the EU, that state has to respect democracy and the rule of law. And the procedure whereby a third state can become a member state of the EU makes this quite explicitly and empowers both the institutions and the member state of the EU to ascertain that any new member state does respect democracy and the rule of law. This requirement has become, again in EU parlance, a fundamental in the accession process. So when we talk about the future accession of Ukraine, of the countries from the Western Balkan, it basically means that the EU institutions and the member state have to ascertain that these candidate countries do meet standards of democracy and rule of law which are shared by the member states. Now, these standards are not only paramount for a state to become a member state of the EU, they're equally important for the member state themselves. And we have seen over the years, as respect for the rule of law and democracy has started to erode within the EU, that actually those standards are now being invoked, including before the European Court of Justice, against the member states that are backsliding, moving away from the standards of membership. And there's been really a massive development, legally speaking, in the standards in terms of articulating what it means to be a democracy within the EU, what it means to respect the rule of law within the EU. The Court of Justice has coined a very important principle in EU law, which is the principle or the duty of the member state not to regress. They have to stick to the commitments they make upon their voluntary and democratic decision to become a member state of the EU. And this duty not to regress, binding the member state, can be enforced before the European Court of Justice. A value to respect democracy, to respect the rule of law, is a founding value of the EU, binding the member states and the candidate states. But it's also in the interest of the EU. It's an interest of the EU and the member state that democracy and the rule of law should be preserved and respected. Why is that so? Well, you can't have an internal market without the rule of law. It simply does not function. The same holds true for the area of freedom, security and justice, to which Norway is closely associated through Schengen. Schengen does not operate if the law is not respected. Similarly, apart from the key importance of the law and the rule of law for the functioning of the EU as a whole in its different facets, the legitimacy of the EU, of its decision-making process, is entirely dependent on member states being democratic member state. Otherwise, the decisions of the Council are going to be contested. If we know that part of the decision-making process of the EU associates states that are not full-fledged democracies. So it is in the interest of the EU that the rule of law and democracy should be respected by the member states, as much as it is a value. These two elements underpin the mandate that the EU has to make sure that member states and EU institutions too respect those principles of democracy and the rule of law. It's a very strong mandate. If you take a look at the treaties, the Treaty on European Union, the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, the so-called Constitutional Charter of the EU, you will see that actually the EU institutions are empowered, if not bound, to promote and defend those values and make sure the EU's interests are preserved. And so you have mechanisms that we have heard about a bit earlier, namely Article 7. Article 7 is a procedure whereby if a member state does no longer meet the commitments of membership, the other member state have the possibility to suspend its membership until the situation is restored. Similarly, the European Commission has what we call an enforcement power. It can sue a member state before the European Court of Justice if it does not comply with its membership obligations. And that can be a directive dealing with the safety of toys, but it also has to do, a fortiori, with the basic requirements of membership. So the European Commission has started to do that a little bit against states which are regressing on their basic membership commitments. So we have a very strong EU mandate to make sure that member states respect democracy and the rule of law. But that mandate is not used to it's not exercised to its fullest extent. That brings me to my second part. And the point has already been made by several speakers. It's very good to have principles written on paper, but if they are not followed, if they are not executed, implemented in practice, then they are not of much use. Now, we have seen over the last few years, in the face of an increasing regression on commitments of membership by several member states, that EU institutions and other member states have tried to address the very worrying development. We have seen Article 7 being triggered against Poland and Hungary. There is a particular dimension of Article 7 which entitles the Council, on the basis of a super-qualifying majority, to establish that there is a risk of a serious breach of the values of the Union. That's the procedure you were referring to. The Commission has also used the enforcement proceedings against several member states on ground that they no longer comply with the basic requirements of membership, in particular relating to the rule of law, and even more specifically because it's been alleged that, for instance, in Poland, the functioning of the judiciary is not compatible with the requirements of membership, insofar as the judiciary is no longer independent and impartial. It's basically been captured by the authorities of the state, the executive, and no longer operates in an impartial and independent manner. And that is not compatible with the requirements of membership. There is a provision in the treaties that require the member state to offer effective judicial protection, and that requires independent courts. So the Commission has started a few procedures against Poland on that ground. But we are very, very far from an effective and consistent use of those mechanisms. With respect to Article 7, actually no decision has been taken by the member states meeting in Council against those states that are prevaricating. There's been delay, the hearings have been unsystematic. Basically, to cut the story short, and at the risk of sounding brutal, I think the Council, i.e. the member states, have deeply mismanaged this procedure. They have not used the procedure adequately, leaving both countries which were the subject of this procedure off the hook. Article 7 has not helped at all, not because there is a default in the procedure, but because the procedure has not been used properly. Similarly, when it comes to the enforcement procedure, the European Commission has been highly unsystematic in using that enforcement procedure. It has been slow. It has not used the whole panoply of instruments in a consistent manner. It has, for instance, a tool whereby it can force a member state that is subject to the enforcement proceeding to suspend the application of a contentious law, the interim relief procedure, which it can combine with financial sanctions in order to make sure that the country concerned does suspend the contentious legislation. The Commission has used these instruments sometimes, but far from the consistency and the systematism that we expect the EU institutions to demonstrate in using those important, quite fundamental instruments for the functioning of the whole EU. So it's been too passive, too timid, the EU I'm talking about, in confronting the erosion of the rule of law and democracy at the level of its member state. And I would say that it's been also too passive in helping those governments that want to restore the rule of law and democracy. If you look at the way the European Commission and the member states have reacted to the change of government in Poland in October 2023, one would be surprised that while indeed the new government had all great intentions to restore the rule of law, to repair democracy, and indeed to restore the full membership of Poland in the European Union, both the Commission and other member states have basically given up all leverage they have to help the Polish government perform that restoration. What I mean by that is that the Article 7 procedure against Poland has been terminated, where the reforms have not been introduced. They are written on paper, they have been shown to the Council, but they have not been introduced in practice. Why is that? Well, partly because within Poland, there are still some constitutional authorities that are blocking the introduction of these reforms. I'm talking about the President of the Republic, who is basically in a position to stop the implementation of those measures. Similarly, we have a captured constitutional tribunal, which is no longer regarded as a court by Strasbourg, and partly in the EU as well, that is captured by the now opposition to make sure that the reforms that the government is trying to introduce in order to restore democracy and the rule of law are regarded as incompatible with the constitution, so that they cannot enter into force. And yet the European Union institutions and other member states are regarding the situation in Poland as if everything was back to normal. Now, that is highly problematic, because it basically means that the situation might not get back to normal, and yet it's regarded as if it were back to normal. The trustworthiness, and that's bringing me to my last point, the trustworthiness in the authority of the EU institutions and other member states as co-guardians of the European Constitution, the law within the EU, their trustworthiness is being damaged by their inability, unwillingness to support those that are trying to restore democracy and the rule of law as required by EU law, and their inability and unwillingness to confront those governments that are continuing to act as free riders and spoilers in the functioning of the EU. And that, of course, means that EU citizens will lose their trust in institutions, in member states, and in the validity of the European Union as an additional source of counterpower to that we have at the national level. The system of checks and balances that we have at national level is happily supplemented by this level of check that we have at the EU level. And if we don't use this additional element to make sure that our democracies resist the pressures of populism, to put it politely, then I think the very relevance of the European Union is going to be questioned, because the EU is far from being simply a market and an area of freedom, security and justice. It is what has actually helped us living in peace and stability over the last few decades, in deep cooperation indeed with the Council of Europe and the various institutions of the Council of Europe, like the Venice Commission and the Court in Strasbourg. That trustworthiness is also being damaged in the eyes of the rest of the world. The EU is now embarking on yet another big bang enlargement towards Ukraine, towards Moldova, towards the countries in the Western Balkans. What authority does it have to require from those states that they are thriving democracies respecting the rule of law if the EU is not capable of making sure that the democracy and the rule of law are respected within its midst? So we have an immense work to do, and that does not require a treaty reform. It does not require the law of the EU to be changed. We have the instruments. They just need to be used effectively. And I'll finish on that happy note.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christophe. I think now we will all, well, you can sit there. I will stand here because we only have 4 chairs. Thank you so much for very interesting and thought-provoking interventions. I would like to maybe give the floor to the 3 first speakers to try to maybe comment on some of the provoking kind of points that Christophe pointed to, because I think these are crucial to because we all agree on the challenge that there is a challenge to fight for democratic standards. We also know that we need to tackle misinformation, we need to increase trust and all this, but the problem is of course how to do it. And I would like you to comment on, what Christophe basically said is that we need to be tougher within, or you, because we're not in the European Union, I tend to say we, but you in the European Union need to be tougher with the member states. And I think for Norway as well is also possible, because we have the instrument that you mentioned, Maria, the EEA grants. So what can Norway do also maybe to be tougher through this instrument? So I'll give the floor maybe to Who would like to start? Maybe Anna first, and
thank
then
you.
Maria.
Yeah, with
Then
pleasure,
here.
because I fully agree with your plea that the EU needs to be tougher on those violating the rule of law within our country, particularly also with regards to the credibility vis-à-vis the enlargement countries. This is actually basically any speech I give on the EU. This is one of the key messages. However, I think in your analysis now, if I may say so, it's very much a lawyer's perspective, no, a legal perspective, and a formal perspective. When you ask the question, why have these instruments not been used, then you come to the political hurdles attached to it. The political hurdles, namely the requirement for the certain majority requirements, for instance, in the Article 7 proceedings. We are currently still in the phase vis-à-vis Hungary to have in the hearing phase. This was a proceeding that also could have been started way earlier and much faster. So I think here there's really room for improvement as well. But in order to move to the next stage of just making a statement as Council that there is a serious risk of, or a clear risk of a serious breach of the fundamental values, we need a 4/5 majority. And a 4/5 majority is very difficult to get. And this would sort of only be a statement where we state, I think, the obvious. And then to the next level of actually suspend this actual suspension of voting rights of Hungary, we need unanimity, right? So in the last years there was always Poland. Now there are some other countries which are not very likely to vote in favor of such a suspension, even though Hungary has clearly shown in many, many ways that they have moved very far away from our fundamental values. So it's not really, unfortunately, not just a legal question, but it's also in the end, because of these voting thresholds, it's a very political question. And therefore, I think one of the key reforms that we need, and yes, that would require so-called treaty change, would be to lower these requirements, because unfortunately in this time and age where we see illiberal parties gaining strength here and there, I think we will have to factor in that it might be again the case in a EU country that a party gets elected that is at odds with the fundamental values and the main consensus of the EU. And therefore I think prior to any enlargement, this is something that we clearly need to do. And then just to have a very brief comment on the Polish case, if you read, for me this was quite a tough decision when we had to take the decision to actually stop the Article 7 proceeding vis-à-vis Hungary, vis-à-vis Poland. And I looked actually very carefully at the text also of the article, and it says there that this article is to be used if there's a clear risk of a serious breach. So it says something also mainly about the future, not necessarily about the status quo, but about the objectives of the government in power for the future. Will the situation likely deteriorate and we need to put a stop sign, or will it likely improve? And yes, it's true that Poland has not yet ameliorated all the concerns, but it has clearly done a lot to improve the situation, and it has clearly shown no indication of whatsoever of further deteriorating the situation. And therefore, I think it was justifiable to stop this proceeding at this point in time. But the Commission continues to watch very closely to what is happening in Poland, and we as other member states do so as well.
Thank you, and I of course agree on everything Anna has just said. And Pernille, you can say "we" when you speak about Europe, the EU, because although we're not a full member, we're the closest non-member with a full integration into the single market, 100+ agreements that supplement it. So we are indeed very much connected, and the EEA grants and Norway grants are among the main tools we have to support the core principles holding the European Value Club together. And I'm so happy that we have just signed the agreement for the next 7-year period, and we are in the process of negotiating MOUs with the 15 countries which we are going to cooperate with. And so, as I said in the introductory remarks as well, the core principle of democracy, human rights, rule of law will be cross-cutting for all of the MOUs. Now, how we balance that when it comes to different countries, well, we will get to that. It will be challenging, no doubt. Because what we are speaking about here is trust. And I want to go back to Anna's example about the bedbugs. And it shows really how easily trust can be dissolved. It takes a lot of time to build it up. It takes no time to tear it down. And the spread of disinformation, and also I heard a concept or word, war of mind, really. There is actually a center of excellence in NATO in Riga working on this very new, well, not very new, but rather new way of targeting people based on their worries, their interests, and really clouding their minds about what is right and what is not, to create discontent and distrust. And so I agree we need to be tougher, but the question is like, how and what? Because we could nod to the importance of fighting for the rights, well, fighting like how, literally. Because what is the biggest problem, the way I see it, is that we take these things for granted. We take democracy, freedom of speech for granted until it starts to disappear. So in terms of being tougher, yes, of course, we need to, but the question is really, are the governments supposed to be tougher? Or are the people living in the government supposed to be tougher? It's our common responsibility to safeguard democratic principles, and I agree we need to do more, a lot more, but it needs to come through a collective effort. Where definitely toughness is a word, but we need to be careful not to be too tough, because in the case of both Poland and Hungary, the question is if we are now within the EU and the broader EEA sense. If we are too tough, then we risk of pushing them away rather than keeping them in. I actually invited our colleague Zuzana Rudzińska-Bluszcz, the Vice Minister for Justice in Poland. She is the right hand of Adam Bodnar, Minister of Justice in Poland. And she is among the people who has inspired me the most. I've met her several times. And she unfortunately couldn't make it here due to difficult logistics. But she's working day and night by the book together with her minister to try and depoliticize a system that was politicized overnight, like trust. You can tear it down, but it takes so much time to rebuild it. And so if we look at the big picture of European democratic backsliding, what Poland gives us is much needed hope. It is a beacon of light in elsewhere quite dark time for European democracies. And so, yes, of course, we need to be tougher on those who are not doing enough to protect democracies, but it's also not to throw the baby out with the bathing water, as we say in Norwegian. Ikke kaste babyen ut med badevannet. Because if we were to be too tough on Poland, who are actually trying to depoliticize the judiciary system, they're trying to do so, but they want to do so by the book, and it takes time. It takes time. It's not done overnight, although tearing down is done overnight. Then I think we would not be doing ourselves a favor. And so from the Norwegian side, we are in this value club. So it's for us, it's existential to use every tool we have in our toolbox. And the EA grants with the 3.2 billion euros, I say again, 3.2 billion euros, that's a lot of money. Even today, that's the most important tool we have. And cooperating and having clear, good dialogue with the beneficiary countries, well, that's a key priority for my government.
I'll just follow up on that before I give you the floor. I just want to follow up on that when it comes to enlargement, because the problem is when you said a lot of money, the EU is using a lot of money, Norway is using a lot of money, Council of Europe is in this also, and but the challenge is that some of this money is going into regimes that actually kind of keeping the regimes in power, state capture. So are we doing the right things? Are we kind of building the trust and building civil society, or are we strengthening some of the governments, like in Serbia, for instance, or some other countries? So do we need to change the kind of the tools, the toolbox? So this is some, but you can wait a little bit to answer that, and then I give the floor to Björn first.
Thank you, Pernille. I want to come back to this issue of being tougher on the member states. I think we have a long way. There's so much in between there, in a way, to where we are today and to becoming so much tougher against the member states. I will try to explain it. Because when it comes to, when we say tougher, of course you're referring to the EU, to Article 7, the possibility of sanctions. The EU also has the economic leverage, so they can really put some strength to these demands. But the situation today is that we don't do by far enough in insisting, in raising awareness, in approaching member states on a systematic way, in raising these issues. So there is a vast area there before you introduce sanctions and so on that only the EU can do. We cannot do it in the Council of Europe because the cooperation there is based on genuine goodwill to implement the European Convention of Human Rights and everything that they have agreed to do. So we have so much space before we come to that in terms of engaging, working systematically, mobilizing civil society, national human rights institutions, and so on and so forth. That's why I think it's so important now to really start to define concrete areas of action, how we're going to work and work together. The Council of Europe, we have 46 member states. We cover all of Europe. The EU is 27. It's crucial, I know. But now we need to focus on all of Europe. So I think this is an important issue.
I'll give the floor to you, Christophe, if you want to comment on some of the things that have been said. And while Christophe is speaking, please sign up if you have questions.
It's interesting, the terminology that we're using, law versus politics, tough versus restoring. I don't think preserving or maintaining Article 7 in relation to Poland or not releasing the money immediately was a matter of being tough. In my world, it was a way of being helpful. It was a way to be helpful to the new government when confronting the remnants of the backsliding authorities. I mentioned the president, I mentioned the so-called constitutional court. If you take away Article 7, if you take away the financial conditionality, you are basically leaving Adam Bodnar, a good friend, on his own, fighting the president in order to try and install or introduce the measures. So it's not about being tough, it was about being helpful. Telling Adam Bodnar, we are with you, and if indeed the president and or the constitutional tribunal behave the way they do, we are going to tell you that they are responsible for you not getting the money, right? The Commission, the member state, gave up all this leverage, basically leaving the new government, including Adam Bodnar, who is really having a tough time indeed, on his own.
But that's what they asked for. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry, this is not correct. No, I work with Adam. Yeah. No, I think it's a bit too easy. That was the aspiration, obviously, of Adam to get rid of Article 7. because that's the ultimate certificate that Poland indeed has restored democracy, the rule of law, and is back in the fold. But it is not. It is not. And my fear is that too much is taken for granted, that they're going to have a new president, the vetoes will be lifted, and somehow the Constitutional Court will be handled. No. The risk is bigger than ever, actually, that Poland could actually go deeper into a serious constitutional situation. And again, the EU and other member states have just basically said, it's no longer our problem. You're on your own. I think it's not the way to restore the trustworthiness of EU institutions and member state authorities in the eyes of the public. I mean, if you ask today across the EU, is the EU strong enough to deal with democratic erosion within the EU? I bet you that there would be quite a clear signal that no, the EU should do more. And not necessarily in a way of being tougher. It should do more to preserve what we have in common, the values we have in common. So it's not a matter of being tough or not tough. It's a matter of doing the job the EU has been endowed with, which is to preserve something that we have carefully, incrementally created as a security policy. Our best security policy today is to make sure that membership does not erode internally. If membership erodes, I think our main insurance policy is going to be less credible, and we're going to have a tougher time. You know, tough. A few years ago, in the midst of the financial crisis, there was one member state when the question of changing the treaties to introduce a particular mechanism to help address some of the issues that arose, one member state basically said, no, unless you give me all this kind of derogations about the functioning of the European Union, I will not approve of the treaty change. That was the United Kingdom. And then the French president basically said, okay, we're going to do it without you. The member states of the EU at the time were ready to say to the UK, look, if you're not on board, we'll do without you. How come they are not able to do that with prevaricating member states who are behaving like free riders and vetocrats today, spoiling the functioning of the EU? Yes, there's a lot of politics involved. I don't dispute that. But the way the political discretion is exercised is, to put it mildly, debatable sometimes. That's my point.
Just maybe a comment, because of course we focus a lot on the EU and the countries that are already members in the EU. But the Council of Europe has often been referred to as the waiting room for those who want to become members in the EU. So maybe we can focus to do even more in those countries before they become members. And that could be, in a way, a preemptive type of work. And of course now we have negotiations started with Ukraine, with Moldova. I think probably also Georgia will come later. We talk about Western Balkans countries and others. Maybe we need to focus even more there and working together to see how the Council of Europe and the EU can really help raise the level of respect for the fundamental standards of democracy, rule of law, and human rights before they become EU members. I know this is a sensitive political question, but I raise it anyhow because I think it's quite important.
Anna.
I just want to, so that I'm not misunderstood, I fully agree with you that the EU needs to do more to stop democratic erosion. Definitely. But as a politician and political scientist, I ask the question, okay, how do we get there, right? And we don't get there by just saying the EU should, but by analyzing of what are the obstacles, why it's not happening right now. And I think some of that is actually, I mean, it's also very new territory. We've only been applying the Article 7 proceedings now for a few years, also the conditionality or the freezing of the funds. So I think one thing that we can do now is to actually improve the mechanics of it, to make sure that these things happen faster, that they are more, that we know each institution knows what to do when. So we've made some very concrete suggestions there. And the second thing, I think we need to apply this conditionality of funds to other areas. So that's our position now also when it comes to the negotiation of the next EU budget, and also actually our position when it comes to the funds that we pay to countries of the Western Balkans. So now in the growth plans, actually a lot of conditionalities when it comes to rule of law are included for additional funding being paid out. And thirdly, I repeat myself, we need to lower the voting thresholds in the Article 7 proceedings. Otherwise, we'll always find one or two member states who say, oh, it's actually not that serious how much rule of law is
Don't you think
violated.
that in itself is important, that we proceed to the vote and let each and every member state take the responsibility of its own position in the Council? I think it would be very important.
No, I think if we do that and we lose it, then the whole proceeding is basically will stop, and I don't think that we'll gain anything from that, unfortunately. I mean,
we're at the very core of so many dilemmas. Once again, the reason for Zuzana Rudzinska-Bluch not being right here in Oslo right now is because she's traveling to Trondheim, where she'll be meeting Domstolsadministrasjonen. And the key topic of cooperation with her and her team is really to see how can we help them build capacity to do their work more efficiently. And in Norway, we have a high level of trust in our judiciary system, and we're looking into how can we help Poland gain the same. And it's really it's a dilemma when I see how hard both Adam and Susanna are working by the book, and there is an increasing level of anticipation in the public, in the Polish people, waiting to when are you really going to deliver the results? And they say, well, we wish we could have done it faster, but we want to do it right by the book, because if we cut corners, then, well, we're back in the same problem as we were. And I think once again, looking at the big picture politically, if Poland is what is giving us hope in this time of democratic backsliding in Europe, kind of going forward with the Article 7 procedure and being very, very, I would once again use the word tough. You were the one introducing it to this conversation, but I think it's the right word to use. If we would have been too tough, I think it would have sent the wrong signal. It would have sent the wrong signal not only to the people of Poland, but also to other European citizens. And it's not the signal we want to send. It is a high risk, because you're correct. It might go wrong. But it's really for us to invest in and do everything we can to support the process so that it won't. But we're at the very, very core. And this is once again a dilemma. Should we be a very tough, or should we try and use our creativeness to try and see how can we use the different tools in our toolbox in a better way, really? And once again, this is the process we're currently in with the EU and the EEA grants. Of how we can kind of boost the process of further pushing Poland in the right direction, because we really, really need good examples right now.
Thank you so much. We have one question from the audience there. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Lars Birkelund. I first have to say that I'm a bit disappointed but not surprised that also this arrangement turned into a mobilization for war against Russia. And in between lines, the notions that only Russia is to blame for the war and only Russia deals with disinformation. I'm disappointed. So my first question will be, why should we trust governments that are so far connected from realities and even facts? Or, I'm speaking about populism, why should the people trust the emperor who says he's got the finest clothes, but when he's really naked? And regarding EU, is the European Union really a beacon of democracy with unelected leaders that censors media, that punishes country that doesn't do what those unelected leaders say, and even threatens non-member Norway with the, if Norway don't imply what's called a fjerde energipakke, I think. So why is really European Union a beacon of democracy? My personal view is that European Union is getting irrelevant, especially because of the development on BRICS. Yeah, I think I was said the two questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, it's very clear who's the aggressor in Europe these days. It's Russia that has invaded Ukraine, killed many people there. And I mean, basically, if you don't believe me, then just think about it, sort of how could this war end in Ukraine? It could end by Russia going home, leaving the Ukrainian people alone. The war would be over next day. If Ukraine would stop fighting, if we would stop supporting Ukraine, it would be the end of Ukraine. It would mean the oppression of many people in Ukraine. So I just want to clarify that. On the other things you said, I think we clearly have very different perspective on things, but I think it clearly shows that we in Norway, we in the EU are a democracy. By us being able to have this conversation and you making these statements here, this would not be possible if we weren't in a democracy.
That's a very good point. Okay, any other questions before we end the seminar? Yeah.
Thank you very much for a fantastic discussion and also for critical voices. I really appreciate that and the ability to have this dialogue. I represent the European Wergeland Center. We work very closely with the Council of Europe with education for democracy and human rights. And my question to you, this is not the topic for this seminar, but in your view, the education systems are doing a lot in terms of democratic resilience, in terms of civic preparedness. What would you highlight as being most important right now, in your opinion, for European area, for the EU and the Council of Europe member states when it comes to education, specifically in this, democratic resilience paradigm? We talked about disinformation. Maybe there is something more. Young people are losing hope. What could that look like?
Thank you. I also want to add to that because we were talking about the bed bugs and the trust, the misinformation. So if you could say a little bit more, what can we do more to kind of counter this misinformation that is out there, especially now with the technologies, the social media, and what you mentioned, Anna, with your daughter. I see the same with my daughters, that they also kind of, you don't trust any media. So what can we do? And then it goes a bit linked to the last question about the educational system. So would like to end on what can we do to try to counter this misinformation that actually flourish and to trust at least some of the information that is out there.
Well, the ability of critical thinking, obviously, about information and disinformation is key. And education and Wergeland Center is doing a fantastic work on that. It's really crucial, and updating the curriculums, making sure it's a cross-cutting subject of all different disciplines. Well, it's key, and knowing that a vast majority of the young population get their news from social media, TikTok, and different types of unedited, very much available social platforms. Well, we need to have a critical look at that. But once again, not in a way, and this is difficult, not in a way that limits the freedom of speech, but perhaps what Anna referred to as the freedom of reach, and try and really inspire a critical discussion about what is really happening, and also updating the whole perception of what kind of war is normal today. Well, there is the classical war, which Russia is fighting every day in Ukraine. And correctly, as Anna said, there is only one country that can end the war. It can be Russia to stop its aggression. Yes. Yes.
NATO provoked this war. NATO provoked this war. Everyone knows that.
No.
That's very interesting, but you have a full right to say that, and we need to uphold. Okay. But once again, critical thinking, democratic education, I think that is the democracy shield #1. And I've been thinking about like democratic shield or democracy shield. What we want to shield and protect is democracy, right?
Right.
So I think it's quite a suiting term. And from the Norwegian government side, we will very much prioritize this at the top of our agenda.
Yeah, thank you. I actually think the question you asked is at the heart of what we're talking about here, because, I mean, the more I get involved with this topic of democratic resilience, and I've really, I think, done quite a lot now and read a lot of the things out there and spoken with many, many experts. For me, I mean, obviously there is no magic bullet, right? And to those out there that propose simple solutions to the complex problems of the world, we don't have sort of simple answers how to deal with that, right? So we have to do many, many things. But one of the key things is really to strengthen civic education and news literacy education in schools. I mean, this is basically where it all starts. And everyone nods now. And I think politicians have been saying that for decades now. And then we always end up by saying, oh, and it needs to be a cross-cutting issue in all the curriculars. But then I wonder, does it really happen?
No.
Is it really prioritized in the education of teachers in the curricula? And no. I mean, at least for Germany, I can say no. Though for Germany to get the answer to that, here my assistant is sitting there. I asked her half a year ago, I asked her I thought, very simple question of how is news literacy actually taught in German schools? And within a week or two, she couldn't give me the answer. And I thought, thought a bit about the competence of her. But then I actually asked around, and no one in Germany knew the answer to this, because we have 16 different states that deal with this issue. And apparently, even though all the politicians have been saying we need to do more with this, nobody had an overview of actually what is currently happening on the news literacy thing in schools. So somehow when it comes to children and education, we often just blur over it and say, yeah, it's important. But then it doesn't happen. So I think we really need to, and it's maybe a task also for the democracy shield, we really need to scale up the action on this. And therefore, my thinking, I've been moving away a bit from this saying, okay, it needs to be cross-cutting, because yes, it does. But I think we also, to emphasize the importance, we really need to make sure that every school has at least one day a year where they deal exclusively with this topic of news literacy, so that we ensure really that all the teachers, all the students are involved are engaged with some level of high quality, pedagogically cutting edge curriculum on news literacy. I think we really need to step up the engagement there.
Thank you. We are a bit over time, but Björn and Christoph, do you want to have some final
Very
words?
briefly then, maybe, of course, I think we all agree on the importance of education in meeting these challenges today. And maybe not in Germany then, Anna, but they are in some European countries now. They are rolling out a new, quite comprehensive education program for young students. And it's all about what does it mean to be a democratic citizen? It's to teaching them to respect others' points of view. It's teaching them to be critical, and that's related again to the other topics we talked about, disinformation and everything on on social media and so on. So it's some good news, and I think Wergeland Center also is contributing to this project, and ambition is to have it all over Europe, but it's starting in different stages and countries by countries, I think. Thank you.
Get the final word.
It's difficult to add anything significant after what has been said already. I think the one element, perhaps it's part of this news literacy, is confronting the kids to the reality out there and not keeping them sitting within their schools, developing their own minds on the basis of what they hear at school. So internationalization, learning languages, and confronting them to the reality out there as part of their education, I suppose. It's so internationalization is not a non-important word. It's really part of the way in which you're going to look at the world in your future as a kid.
That's a Good way to end, and thank you so much to all of you for very good introductions and a very fruitful discussion, and thank you to all for coming.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Great. Yeah.
Good introduction. And I give you my card. You worked a lot of